Hi, this is Tom Barnett. I'm the head judge for Wikistrat's International Grand Strategy Competition. As you may know, we've amassed teams from 30 different universities and think tanks, teams of graduate students and interns that are competing in this 4-week competition to generate national grand strategies in relation to 5 major issue areas currently at play in the international environment, those being the Sino-American relationship, global economic rebalancing, issue of energy security, the radical Salafi jihadist threat, and proliferation in Southwest Asia. These 30-plus teams are spread across about a dozen different countries, meaning we have competing teams, a number of them for each country, so that teams not only compete as India against other countries, but they compete against other Indias to be the best India, so to speak. So that combination of intra-competition within countries and competitions between teams from different countries gives us kind of the collaborative and competitive atmosphere that we're looking here to explore and exploit what we consider to be the major attributes of the wiki-based approach to strategic planning. So we wanted to give you some sense of the initial lessons learned or observations that we put together on the basis of this first week of entries that we amassed. What we asked the teams to do in the first week was basically give us their country's definition of core interests in relation to those 5 strategic issue areas I just named. That means they cranked out basically 5 different pages looking at those 5 different issues, one each, and each of those pages were about 5,000 words, meaning with 31 teams competing, we had roughly a couple 100,000 words spread across 150 different wiki pages. So a lot of interesting stuff, and these are the major observations we wanted to share with you based on the first week of the competition and the completion of the first week of grading, which I personally conducted or oversaw. Basically, the first point we'd like to make, and it's rather unsurprising given that this is the kind of the focus that we bring to the whole subject matter, is that we think the notion of collaborative competition really was proven, and in a rather amazing way. Obviously, this is the core concept of Wikistrat. But for as long as I've been associated with the company, I never really got a chance to see this play out as vividly as in this competition. So for me personally, as somebody in the field for almost a couple dozen years now, it was fascinating to observe and to see it laid out in terms of the grading that I ended up doing across these 31 teams, that the country groupings that were the most competitive, it wasn't a destructive process. The North Korea pair, for example, highly competitive against each other. Both of them did incredibly well in the larger rank orderings against all 31 teams, primarily because they were so competitive between each other. Ditto for the Indian trio, ditto for the Iranian trio. The tighter, the tougher the competition within the country group, the better all those teams did. And you might at first glance look at that and say, well, that's almost like the kid in the class taking the test and looking over at the next student's test paper and sort of cheating by seeing what he's writing down. I mean, doesn't that ruin the whole secrecy argument? Doesn't that make it harder for you to keep secrets if you're sharing collaboratively within an organization, within a government? Doesn't that kind of ruin some of the surprise? And wouldn't it be evident in a competition like this that teams competing against each other to be the best India or to be the best Iran would want to hold back their material to the last minute on the deadline and then put it forward to make sure that they couldn't be copied by their competition? Well, it turns out to be just the opposite. The sooner you get your material out, the more your competitors in your grouping can see it, the more they're going to copy and challenge and do better jobs at what you've just laid out, and the more that pushes you to raise your bar in terms of your entries. So from a grading perspective, and I really think from a policymaker's perspective or a decision maker's perspective, it's better to have that kind of collaborative competition because the entries began to look more like each other. They got a lot more expansive in their coverage because everybody had to kind of one-up everybody else. It was easier to compare the two approaches, but they were also, when they were fully laid out, much more competitive in the rank ordering process when we took those 3 India entries, for example, and threw them up against all the other countries' entries. So we think this really does prove that life doesn't unfold with everybody's desks turned towards the teacher. We tend to turn our desks toward one another. We tend to collaborate. That's the real world you're going to operate in as strategists and analysts. And we think it's proven in this kind of collaborative, competitive environment that you get the best answers when you subject your company's strategy or your country's strategy to very intense competitive pressures internally before unleashing them in the wild, so to speak. Another point or another observation we had from this first week, and we made this emphasis very clearly in a lot of the preparatory materials, this is not a war game. So jumping to the punchline is not what we're looking for here. We're looking for contemplation, deep exploration, strategic planning. That's what this is, a strategic planning exercise. So we had a lot of eager beavers in the first week. We saw this in some of the early entries and in some of the original conversations online. It was like, when do I get to bomb this country? When do we get to go to war? When do we get to make some bold diplomatic push? And the whole point of this first week was to chill everybody out, get everybody thinking about interests, and force them to go through the template of breaking out your political interests, breaking out your economic interests, not the same as your political interests all the time, breaking out your security interests, putting them across all 5 of those issue areas, and really getting you grounded in your country's persona. That was important because it really allows contestants to think through not just what can be gained in the competition that's going to follow over the next weeks, but really what can be lost. And the notion of kind of defining your national interests and as much as possible kind of getting a sense as to where tipping points are reached in terms of these so-called fixed national interests. It really does reveal the truth that they're not as fixed as everybody makes them out to be. No matter what regime you're talking about, even when it comes to definitions of survival, these things are fungible and negotiable under the right conditions. And we wanted to get that point across early in the competition, and we think it was sufficiently arrived at in terms of the experience forced upon the participants in terms of thinking out and stretching and disaggregating and comparing across these 5 very different issue areas what are the core interest areas, core interests for any country. And as much as possible, and that's the third point we'd like to make, we'd like to emphasize that, as much as we go through this process of defining core interests for any country, one of the observations we can make is the more you get caught up in those core interests and the more expansively you define them, we notice the less creative the strategic thinking involved for any one team. And that's because, the more you kind of circumscribe or divide up the world in terms of your core interests, the more you limit your flexibility in the foreign policy ideas that you can pursue. And it was interesting, one of the most competitive team groupings we had were the North Korean duo. And at first glance, and coming into the competition, I thought, boy, who would want to be North Korea? Because, they're so tight in the way they define their core interests. How much flexibility can you have in something like that? Well, the 2 teams that took on the persona of North Korea were highly creative in defining the country's national interests, and in part because they were very focused, and they kept their definitions of regime survival and what were the core interests surrounding regime survival in North Korea to a pretty, distinct and discrete definition. And we found that that's crucial. It's not about having the most lengthy lists of core interests. It's about trying to keep the whole approach down to the essence of what your regime is all about, what your country's trying to pursue. So that was the second observation, As much as we try to get people to define core interests, you don't want to be too trapped in that perspective. You don't want to be too caught up in your definition of what your company or your country's guiding ethos is. In this world, trouble comes looking for you in many instances through all the connections that we involve ourselves in as individuals, companies, corporations, countries. And you have to be flexible as much as possible. Another point we'd like to make, what you see in this world, and we see this in the competition in the first week, often depends on where you sit. And in some ways our teams were almost too good at being, in some instances, representative of the mindsets of the countries that they were trying to inhabit. The Japanese teams were almost a little bit too careful in their approach. The European teams were a little too obsessed with rules. The American teams were a little too self-confident, a little too expansive in the way they defined things. The Israelis were a little too dug in, a little too siege mentality in their perspective, and not being able to escape beyond the boundaries of their country in some instances. Same with the Iranians, and to a certain extent, same with the Pakistanis. So good that everybody was involving themselves into these mindsets. But the point being, you can't limit yourself necessarily in your creativity to those issues that are most core to your regime. We found that in the subject matters that were most kind of easily tied to the countries, say you're the Europeans and you're talking about economic rebalancing or the Chimerica relationship, it was easier for teams to get involved in issues that were kind of geographically close to them. And in some instances where the issues seemed distant, like Japan considering the jihadist threat way over in the Middle East, there we saw in many instances the teams becoming less creative. And if you think about it, diplomacy is really the first and last tool of grand strategy. It's what you do all the way up to the war, and it's how you end wars. And in many ways, you should feel free, and it's kind of a truism, we think, in terms of strategic planning. You should feel freest to be most creative in many instances in those areas where your issues are, your interests are actually the thinnest. Where you don't have the dog in the fight is actually where you can be more creative and more opportunistic. And if you think about it, the rise of kind of what I call the new core, or what some people call the second tier powers, like a Turkey, like a Brazil, these are the countries that in many instances are coming into regions, coming into issue areas where they don't have core interests involved, and they're being the most innovative and creative diplomatic players in the field. So that's something we observed from the first week in competition, and it's sort of an admonition we're offering to the country teams. Don't be afraid to be bold just because you think the issue area isn't that central to your country's perspective. And then a last point we'd like to make, and it's sort of in conjunction with the whole Wikistrat philosophy, and it's certainly something that I've pursued throughout my career and spent a lot of time writing about and trying to explain. And that's the notion of a kind of lateral thinking, the value of lateral thinking. Some people may deride this as sort of shallow thinking, instead of drilling down deeply and historically on every single issue, kind of balancing that perspective with a sense as to how everything interconnects, the interdependencies. That's how we labeled it in our grading and how we encouraged the teams to think about it in terms of the entries they made in this first week. One of the lessons we took from the first week of competition was that the teams that kind of got too much into the history of the country in many ways were less creative, because they got so kind of grievance oriented and so kind of chip on their shoulder with regard to past history, that when it came time to thinking about future alternatives, they were kind of burdened by the past too much. So we say, in effect, know your history, but don't know it too well. Don't get too caught up in it. And this kind of shallow thinking that people talk about with regard to the millennial generation, which is basically the generation of our competitors, people a little bit too obsessed with all the connections and all the complexity and all the networking and all the Twitter and everything else. That's actually a pretty good skill set in a complex, interdependent world, because being able to see beyond the immediate issue to the adjacent issues really gives you the sense as to the network workaround possibilities in this connected world. And it gives gives you the perspective that allows for the creativity and those kind of network workarounds to emerge. So that's really something that we try to foster with the whole Wikistrat concept. Don't get too wrapped around the axle in any one issue. There are always alternatives. Always look to adjacent issue areas to see what those alternatives are. If you're stuck thinking about proliferation, well, consider the demographics, consider the economics, go to a different perspective. There you may see the workaround. And we saw that the country teams that kind of had the most references to non-topic issues, I mean, if they're talking about proliferation and then they bring in all these other adjacent issues, those were the teams that were the most creative. And again, along the lines of this kind of collaborative, wiki-based environment, we thought that validated the approach of trying to encourage horizontal thinking, as I like to call it, that kind of lateral processing of complexity that gives you the critical mass situational awareness to really understand where your country or your company or whatever it is that you're trying to strategize about, where it's located in the universe, what its options are. Not just looking backward to history, not just looking forward and trying to imagine the future, but knowing where you are in relation to everything else in this complex world. We think that's a skill set that's increasingly in demand, and the much derided millennials with their so-called shallow thinking, this constant networking kind of mindset and perspective that they bring to bear, we think that's actually a tremendous asset, and it's something that we're trying to encourage in terms of a skill set at Wikistrat, and it's something we hope to be able to bring out as much as possible in this competition. So there are our overriding observations. Obviously, a tremendous amount of creative output in the first week. We just wrapped up the inputs on the second week. I dived back into the immense amount of grading that I just came off of on the first week. So I'm working, and everybody at Wikistrat is working as hard as everybody involved in this competition, and we couldn't be more excited by your participation. And again, thank you for it, and we assume that the learning is only going to get more interesting as we really move into the strategizing segment of our competition.